So typically when we look at the issue of the calorie, it's usually in relationship to what's referred to as the caloric balance. That is, what is the relationship between the calories that are contained within the foods and beverages that we eat relative to the calories that are expended due to bodily functions and physical activity. The problem with this is that it oversimplifies what is actually happening. It's not about the caloric content that is there when it relates to whole body metabolism. The acute imbalance of calories on a day-to-day basis has zero impact on whole body metabolism, and the chronic caloric imbalance doesn't necessarily lead to body compositional changes the way that we think about. In actuality, it's more about the fuel balance. That is, what is my nutrient balance? What is my nutrient intake relative to my nutrient expenditure? And this is where each tissue of the body is going to have a different nutrient demand and a different nutrient expenditure based off of what type of metabolism they will be predominantly involved in. And this is where we have to look at what is the person doing and how do the nutrients that are being consumed relate to the expenditure of those nutrients to allow for the tissues to energetically meet the demands and then secondarily repair themselves to any stresses that have been encountered throughout the day. When we look at this issue, what we have to do is we have to look at what is going to impact both the energy expenditure as well as the nutrient expenditure on a daily basis, in which we have different compositions that are going to determine this, including the gender of the person, the age of the person, the body composition of the person, their general level of activity, and their overall health status. Of these, body composition, activity level, and health status are all modifiable factors that will alter hormonal and epigenetic regulators that will determine what the energetic demand for the person happens to be and what the nutrient demand for the person happens to be. In which we have to look at how do I know what is enough for me or enough for our patients or our clients that we're going to be working with. In this way here, we can determine a couple of things. We can determine the general level of energy demand that a person has based on what's referred to as the resting or basal metabolic rate or the resting energy expenditures. And then we can look at, based off of what is their energetic demand and then what types of activities are they engaging with, we can determine their nutrient demands. We can actually develop an overall diet based off of their metabolic demands so that we meet both the energetic demand that is necessary as well as the nutrient demand that is necessary. In this, we will go about utilizing an estimated level of energetic demand. The estimated level of energetic demand is based off of a host of equations, and we'll take a look at each one of these equations when we get into lab time. But one of the easier equations that we use in the realm of physical activity and exercise are these equations right here. Now, notice that they are different based off of the units that we are going to be dealing with, whether they are the imperial English units or the universal metric calculations, and then based off of whether they are male or female. Now notice there's a clause in here, and that's what's referred to as the ACF, the activity converting factor. So the first part of that is the basal part. That is, what do I need in terms of amount of energy just to survive? The converting factor is what am I doing outside of just breathing and allowing my neurons to function and allowing my respiratory system to function and allowing my cardiovascular system to function. What else do I need? And this is where if I am just doing normal daily things, walking around, getting off the couch, getting out of bed, I have to add 30%. So I have to multiply by 1.3. If I do those normal things and then I increase my level of activity by adding a little bit of light physical activity, that is where I'm not breathing hard, I'm not exerting myself overly during the day, then I add 40%. If I start doing exercise, then I start increasing and add about 60%. If I start doing strenuous exercise, then I can go about doing 80%. Now, if you look at what most people will quote unquote recommend, they'll say, oh, your metabolic demand is about 2000 kcal per day. But what I want you to do right now is I want you to go about and calculate your own BMR. Calculate your own basal metabolic rate and see, does it actually work out to 2000 kcal? But what we have to look at is just because we have a caloric balance doesn't necessarily mean we have a nutrient balance. And this is where we have to go about and look at what nutrients do we need in order to meet the nutrient demand that we're placing on the body. In this case here, we have to is nutrition. And nutrition is simply making sure that we have the essential nutrients to perform at our optimal level based off of what we are asking the body to do, in which some of those nutrients will be used for ATP regeneration. And this is going to be based off of the obligated tissues that will be there, in which some cells will only use certain types of nutrients and other cells will only use other types of nutrients to meet their ATP regeneration demands. And then we have other obligations that we need in order to allow for tissue repair and recovery from a homeostatic disruption. If we don't get the nutrients that we need, we have to somehow get nutrients from other places. And if we have drastic nutrient reduction, we can actually undergo a dysregulated response. If we have excessive amounts of nutrients, we can have a dysregulated response. And that's how issues related to overfatness come into play. And this is where issues of anorexic come into play. Which takes us to the diet. And for a lot of times, a lot of people will consider that diets to be a 4-letter word. But the problem is that even though, yes, it is 4 letters, it's not a bad word. And that's what we mean when we say a 4-letter word. It's not a bad word. Now, most medical and health dietitians will note that there's not an ideal diet. So we can't generalize a diet. We have to tailor the diet. We have to tailor the diet based off of some guidelines. We have to make sure that there's a variety of food that's being taken in. We have to make sure that we balance the food intake to what we are expending, the caloric balance that everybody talks about, which is actually the nutrient balance. We have to choose diets where carbohydrates come from whole sources as opposed to processed sources. We have to choose diets that are quote unquote moderate in fat, but notice there's a question mark there. We have to choose diets that are moderate in sugars. Once again, there's a question mark there. And we have to choose diets that are moderate in salt and sodium. Once again, there's a question mark there. And the reason why there's a question mark next to the last 3 points is because research has shown recently that those may not always be true. High-fat diets that are low in sugar are actually more beneficial to individuals than diets that are high in sugar and low in fat. And that has to do with what body fat is going to be developed from. The moderate levels of salt and sodium is going to be dependent upon the level of activity for a person. Now, for people who are hypertensive, there's a general recommendation to reduce salt and sodium. And that has to do with the fact that about 5% of the population is salt sensitive. But without doing genetic analysis on everybody, it's very hard to determine who that 5% happened to be. Nutrition is going to directly impact metabolism. It's going to affect metabolism based off what's referred to as substrate availability. That is, do I have the substrate available for the metabolism that is necessary to perform, either to regenerate ATP or to allow for rebuilding of tissues to allow for return to homeostasis. Nutrition is going to be a vital component as relates to fitness for the person or health status for the person, which includes things like muscle strength and endurance, metabolic flexibility, that's the ability to utilize various nutrients for ATP regeneration. It's going to impact cardiovascular endurance. It's going to impact immune response to stress or immune response to infection. It's vital to neurological and cognitive functioning. You have to have somewhere around 120 grams of carbohydrates, in particular glucose, in order to allow for neural functioning. If I don't meet that threshold, I somehow have to generate the glucose through processes of gluconeogenesis that will allow for neurological and cognitive functioning to take place. Nutrition, and by affecting metabolism, can and does directly influence body composition, where poor nutritional habits will lead to poor body compositional issues, both overfatness and excessive underfatness or anorexia. And so we're going to jump in here and take a look at diet compositions in the next segment. The last way that nutrition is going to affect metabolism is it's going to affect metabolism based off of hormonal regulations. Based off of nutrient load and nutrient balance, we will get changes of hormonal functioning that will regulate the way in which we establish our basal metabolic rate, as well as our aerobic metabolism versus our anaerobic metabolism. This goes into the concept of neuroendocrine function and how nutrition will impact the production of hormones. And by changing hormonal regulation, we change the overall responses that we get at the tissue. The key hormones that get impacted by nutrition directly include leptin, ghrelin, growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen. Changes of those will impact rates of tissue growth. At the same time, nutrition will impact metabolism by causing increase of tissue breakdown. When we don't have appropriate nutrition load, we'll see increasing levels of glucagon, increasing levels of cortisol that will start to break down tissues. The other thing that we look at when it comes to nutrition affecting metabolism is how it's going to impact tissue growth relative to tissue breakdown in regard to levels of activity, where if we are able to get nutrients available close to the end of activity, we're able to generate a positive nutrient balance, which will allow for proper tissue repair without having excessive amounts of inflammation. By doing so, we increase the ability to do and perform for prolonged periods of time without detriment to the person.